5 bodies. A crime scene so violent that a 20-year veteran cop said he'd never seen anything like it. And the man responsible? He wasn't in the house. He never touched a weapon. He never even stepped through the door. He simply told 5 young people what to do, and they did it, without hesitation, without question. Tonight, we're going to figure out how that's even possible. How a man with no money, no army, and no weapon became one of the most dangerous people in American history. He never held a weapon, and still started one of the most violent nights in American history. Charles Manson was 32 years old, and he had spent more than half of his life behind bars. Petty theft. Forgery. Pimping. Nothing that screamed criminal mastermind. He was short, unimpressive to look at, and had barely finished grade school. On paper, he was nobody. But Manson had one skill that made up for everything else. He could look at a person for 30 seconds and know exactly what they were missing in their life. And exactly what to say to make them feel like he was the one who could give it to them. When he was released from prison in March of 1967, he reportedly asked the warden to let him stay. He'd spent so much of his life institutionalized that the outside world genuinely scared him. Within months, that same frightened, uncertain man walked straight into the middle of San Francisco's summer of love. A city flooded with runaways, dropouts, and disillusioned kids who'd rejected everything their parents believed in, and were desperately looking for something to believe in instead. Manson had the pitch ready. He talked about freedom. About love. About tearing down the old world. And one by one, they started following him home. What made Manson terrifyingly effective wasn't charisma alone, it was a system. He would keep his followers up for days at a time during group sessions, breaking down their ability to think clearly through pure exhaustion. He used LSD constantly, but not for fun. He administered it during carefully staged sessions where he'd guide their thoughts, reshaping how they saw their pasts, their families, and him. He systematically dismantled every relationship that could compete with his authority, encouraging followers to walk away from partners, from parents, even from their own children. By 1968, the group, which called itself simply The Family, had moved to Spahn Ranch, an abandoned western movie set on the edge of Los Angeles, rented for almost nothing from an elderly, nearly blind owner. Out there, miles from anyone who might ask questions, Manson's control became absolute. Followers who had once been college students, waitresses, teenagers, people with names and families and futures, started referring to themselves only by names Manson gave them. And then, in late 1968, something happened that pushed Manson from a strange cult leader into something far more dangerous. He became obsessed with a song. The song was Helter Skelter, off the Beatles' White Album. Where every other listener on the planet heard a chaotic rock track, Manson heard prophecy. He became convinced the album contained hidden messages predicting an imminent race war that would nearly destroy the country. And his theory went further than prediction. He told the family that once the war began, Black Americans would win, but wouldn't know how to govern afterward. Manson and his followers, having hidden safely in the desert the whole time, would then emerge to take control. Read out loud, it sounds like the ramblings of someone who needed serious help. But by this point, many members of the family had spent nearly 2 years having their independent judgment systematically taken apart, piece by piece. To them, it didn't sound insane. It sounded like the only truth that made sense. Manson decided he couldn't just wait for the war to start on its own. He'd have to light the fuse himself. Before we get to the 2 nights that made Manson infamous, one name is worth pausing on. Sharon Tate was 26 years old, 8.5 months pregnant, and an actress known, by nearly everyone who worked with her, for treating film crews with a kindness most stars never bothered with. She wasn't a headline. She was a person with a due date, a nursery already set up, and plans for the following week that she never got to keep. On the night of August 8, 1969, Manson gathered 4 of his followers, Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, and gave them an address on Cielo Drive, along with one instruction: leave nothing alive. He didn't choose the house because he knew who lived there. He chose it because months earlier, he'd shown up to a party there and been turned away at the door by the home's previous tenant. Manson himself never went inside. He stayed behind while the 4 of them drove up the hill in the dark. What happened inside that house has been documented extensively elsewhere, and we're not going to walk through it here. 5 people died that night, including Tate, just weeks from giving birth. The next night, apparently unsatisfied that the first murders hadn't been chaotic enough to convincingly frame a militant group, Manson went along with the family himself to a completely different house, in a completely different neighborhood, chosen essentially at random. He still didn't do the killing. He left that, once again, to his followers. Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, a grocery store owner and his wife with absolutely no connection to Hollywood, to fame, or to Manson, were murdered inside their own home simply because their house was next on a list of nobody in particular. At both scenes, the killers left messages written in the victim's blood. Phrases meant to make investigators believe a black militant group was responsible, exactly as Manson had planned. It worked, for a while. It would take police months to connect either crime scene back to a washed-up ex-con living on an old movie ranch. When Manson finally stood trial in 1970, he didn't behave like a man fighting for his life. He carved an X into his own forehead, later turning it into a swastika, and instructed his co-defendants to do the same. Outside the courthouse, family members who hadn't even been charged with anything camped on the sidewalk day after day, some kneeling, chanting his name for the cameras. Inside, the loyalty held disturbingly firm. Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten testified in ways that seemed designed to protect Manson rather than themselves, even while facing life in prison. It wasn't until years later, once they were finally separated from him and from each other, that several of them started describing what had actually been done to them: the sleep deprivation, the manipulation, the total isolation from anyone who might have pulled them out. Manson was never convicted of physically killing anyone with his own hands. Prosecutors instead argued, successfully, that his words alone made him just as legally responsible as if he'd held the knife himself, one of the first major cases to hinge on that argument. He was sentenced to death, later commuted to life in prison. He remained behind bars until he died in 2017, denied parole 12 separate times. But here's the detail most documentaries skip entirely. Weeks before the Tate LaBianca murders, Manson shot another man, a small-time associate named Bernard Crowe, over a drug deal gone wrong, and believed he'd killed him. He hadn't. Crowe survived. But convinced that retaliation was coming, Manson spiraled into paranoia in the weeks leading up to August 1969. Some historians now argue the murders weren't a calculated first strike in a master plan at all. Just the panicked improvisation of a man who thought he'd already started a war he couldn't survive, and was trying to redirect the blame before it caught up with him. Charles Manson never held a knife on either of those nights. He didn't need to. He'd spent 2 years making sure other people would do it for him, and decades later, researchers studying coercive control and cult psychology still use the Manson family as one of the clearest examples of how that actually works. If you made it this far, you now know something most people who watched a dozen Manson documentaries still don't. If this case kept you thinking a little longer than you planned, that's exactly what this channel is built for. Subscribe, because every week we open a new file like this one, the details other channels leave out. And next time, we're covering a predator who worked in the exact opposite way. No crowd. No family. Just total isolation. It might be even harder to watch.